Hello everyone, my name is Eric. I'm a limited licensed master social worker and psychotherapist. I've been working with children, youth, and adults for 10 years. On today's episode of So You Want to Learn Psychology, we're going to be taking a look at one of the books that really transformed my view of psychology and psychotherapy. A Blue Fire is a collection of the work of James Hillman. Hillman was an analytical psychologist who eventually became the director of studies at the C.G. Jung Institute in Zurich, Switzerland, until 1969. Hillman, like many others, was a student of Jung, but unlike many of Jung's other students, Hillman was successfully able to establish his own model of psychotherapy, which he called archetypal psychology. It's basically Jungian psychotherapy with an artistic inspiration that's dialed up to 11. A Blue Fire is a collection of insights that spanned Hillman's life and career. But if there's one thing that I know James Hillman for, it's his incredible talent for describing the poetics of psychotherapy. Even if every Jungian analyst must know the myths, the symbolism, and the archetypes, Hillman knew better than anyone else their artistic and poetic nature. In this video, I'll share a few passages from A Blue Fire that have inspired me and the work that I do with my patients. I think that if you're interested in Jungian psychology at all, you need to read James Hillman. He presents a different side of analytical psychology that sheds light on the more emotional, sensational, and feeling-toned aspects of personal development and self-transformation that complement Jung's more intellectual and intuitive perspectives. Once, I had a patient ask me, "What is psychotherapy?" She was asking because her insurance covered psychotherapy and not therapy, as she generally knew it. Most professionals will tell you that there is no difference between psychotherapy and therapy, that they're the same thing. If you couldn't already tell by my tone of voice, I believe that this couldn't be further from the truth. A brief history. In the beginning of what is traditionally called psychotherapy, there was psychoanalysis. Even Jung studied psychoanalysis under Freud, and eventually split off and created his own system of psychodynamic psychotherapy. Around the late 1930s and 1940s, there was a movement away from psychoanalysis and toward behavior therapy. Behavior therapists like Pavlov, Skinner, and Bandura were able to demonstrate social learning theory and how it makes sense of human behavior. They regarded the patient's inner world as little more than meaningless due to their inability to study it scientifically. Behaviors were observable, thoughts, emotions, and unconscious conflicts were not, and therefore they could not be relied upon as valid scientific sources of information or evidence. As the decades passed, traditional psychodynamic approaches to psychology and psychotherapy split away from behaviorist theories. This ultimately culminated in Aaron Beck's cognitive psychology and the development of CBT, which does not at all concern itself with man's unconscious mind, and views every aspect of mental health and mental illness as cognitive processes and their influence upon our perceptions and our reality. Put simply, mental illness is the result of malignant biology and genetics influenced and worsened by our personal inability to think correctly. We'll talk about CBT and cognitive distortions and thinking errors in a future episode. So when a person asks me, "What is psychotherapy?" I generally tell them that psychotherapy is therapy for the soul, and that therapy, as it's more generally referred to, is an active attempt to improve our ability to think logically and rationally. That's CBT. I have patients that are more in need of CBT, learning to recognize and challenge maladaptive thoughts and negative core beliefs, and then I have patients who are engaging only in psychotherapy. These are people who, in general, are trying to figure themselves out. Sometimes I can hardly find anything wrong with how they think, or how they interpret the world. In fact, I find myself agreeing with them quite often, and sometimes I find it hard to challenge them because they're not being illogical, irrational, or acting grossly out of character. They are simply trying to understand themselves. This is the essence of true psychotherapy. It's why cognitive behavior therapy can produce results in months, whereas psychotherapy can take years. It's why the aim of CBT is to change thoughts, emotions, and behaviors, and why traditional psychotherapy was always aimed at changing the patient's personality. Hillman's words have always stuck with me. All modern therapies which claim that action is more curative than words, and which seek techniques other than talk, rather than in addition to it, are repressing the most human of all faculties, the telling of the tales of our souls. These therapies may be curative of the child in us, who has not learned to speak, or the animal who cannot, or the spirit that is beyond words because it is beyond soul. But only continued attempts at accurate soul speech can cure our speech of its chatter and restore it to its first function, the communication of the soul. CBT is an incredible evidence-based toolkit that is now implemented in almost all forms of therapy in some shape or form. Its focus on symptom remission is what makes it so popular and useful. If someone's feeling depressed, and their goal is to not feel depressed, well, that's fairly straightforward. In therapy, we figure out why you're depressed and what you can do about it. Simple and effective. Symptoms treated, depression lifted. But that doesn't work for everyone. For many of us, it's much deeper than that. And while CBT techniques and strategies for changing our thoughts and behaviors are helpful, it's more often than not that I meet people whose internal difficulties cannot be solved by CBT alone. Hillman writes, "An analyst often finds himself purposefully passing by the symptoms appearing in his practice. Rather than investigate these symptoms, he turns to the life which has fostered the pathology. His premise is that the disease has its meaning in the life of the patient, and he tries to understand this meaning. He cannot hold out on the usual hope for cure or even relief of symptoms. His analytical experience says that the hope which the patient presents is part of the pathology itself. The patient's hope arises as an essential part of the constellation of his suffering. It is frequently governed by impossible demands to be free of suffering itself. The same condition that constellated the symptoms is the condition which these symptoms are interrupting, and killing, or curing. Therefore, an analyst does not hope for the return of the condition out of which the symptoms and hope for relief arose. Because hope has this core of illusion, it favors repression. By hoping for the status quo ante, we repress the present state of weakness and suffering and all that it can bring. Postures of strength are responsible for many major complaints today: ulcers, vascular and coronary conditions, high blood pressure, stress syndrome, alcoholism, highway and sports accidents, mental breakdown. The will to fall ill, like the impulse to suicide, leads patient and physician face to face with morbidity, which stubbornly returns in spite of all hope to the contrary. One might ask if medical hope itself is not partly responsible for recurrent illness, since it never fully allows for weakness and suffering. The death experience is not able to produce its meaning. Experiences are cheated of their thorough effect by a speedy recovery. Until the soul has got what it wants, it must fall ill again, and another iatrogenic cycle of recurrent illness begins. People who have had deeply troubling experiences, difficult lives magnified by loss and trauma, can only benefit so much from therapy without engaging themselves at the soul level. To the dismay of many parents that I've worked with in the past, behavior therapy for their children simply isn't appropriate for them. The behaviors and emotions that they were concerned about were unaffected by traditional behavior therapy and play therapy, and I often find myself simply telling them that their kids will have to grow out of these behaviors, for lack of a better term, because that is the soul's task, not the task of behavior therapy. The fact is, if behavior therapy was going to work, you'd see improvement relatively quickly. And if it doesn't work, you'll know why. Because we're no longer working at the level of thoughts, emotions, and behaviors, but at the soul level, which, obviously, is difficult for children to tap into. That's not to say that children are soulless. On the contrary, they're often full of soul, more so than many adults. But they're unable to articulate it linguistically and intellectually. And they typically express their soul through their imagination, big emotions, and artistic abilities. It's something we don't want to get rid of, but live through. True psychotherapy recognizes every aspect of a person's experience, as well as their personality. That means giving credence to the ego, as well as the persona and shadow, and even understanding that a person's pain and suffering may be meaningful and necessary. In fact, Jung once said that the principal aim of psychotherapy is not to transport the patient to an impossible state of happiness, but to help him acquire steadfastness and philosophic patience in the face of suffering. Life demands for its completion and fulfillment a balance between joy and sorrow. And what Hillman writes further illuminates this point. There may well be more psychopathology going on while transcending than while being immersed in pathologizing. For any attempt at self-realization without the full recognition of the psychopathology that resides, as Hegel said, inherently in the soul is in itself pathological, an exercise in self-deception. Such self-realizations turn out to be a paranoid delusional system, or even a kind of charlatanism, the psychopathic behavior of an emptied soul. Real psychotherapy is not easily defined. It's ambiguous, unrestrained, and difficult to measure, all things which our medical system struggle with. Psychotherapy can mean many things, and it can mean different things to different people. James Hillman's A Blue Fire and his more famous work, Revisioning Psychology, both show just how creative, unbounded, and full of potential psychotherapy can really be when it's not restrained to simply teaching coping skills and changing behavior. It's definitely not the same thing as therapy, as we commonly call it. That concludes this week's episode of So, You Want to Learn Psychology? I hope you enjoyed. We're going to be exploring more of James Hillman's work in the future, but for next week I'll be changing things up a bit to celebrate my favorite holiday. Leave a comment below with any book recommendations for future episodes. I also have an Instagram page with all my books, so you can see some of the things that we'll be covering on this channel in the future ahead of time. Thank you for your continued support. Until next time.